Consensus will have to be to pick a character that most interests you. What character does the group want to analyze first?
I think Maggie.
Yeah. So we're going to focus today's clinical attention on Maggie. So, generally speaking, what did you see that interested you? Please don't jump to any diagnoses or clinical terminology. Simply, what did you see?
Well, I thought there's a lot of things that I thought were interesting, but one thing I was waiting for them to explain through the whole film that they never did was this illness that she has, these blood transfusions she's getting, this care that she has to take so she doesn't contract anything by going out in the world. And I just thought that was an interesting part of her character that was never really addressed, and I think that they intentionally left it unaddressed.
So, to paraphrase, and again, if I'm putting words in your mouth, let me know. But the character does seem to demonstrate that there is a chronic condition for which she is currently undergoing treatment. The details of which are a little bit sketchy, but at least appears to require frequent blood transfusions, right? All right, what else did we see?
There's also the case where I think the FBI agent mentioned it, that her name was like Shelley Whittle, but she states that she was born 2 years ago and that her name is Maggie. So I thought that was kind of an interesting discrepancy between Maggie's story and what the government has on record.
Sure. So if presenting for that particular medical condition, this is the past medical history. Certainly if we think that there's something psychiatric going on, to be determined, perhaps the past psychiatric history, but at least we would look at this information as part of the routine social history that we're actually being told. Patients self-report that she came into existence 2 years ago, kind of, which of course is inconsistent with what the clinician would expect to hear from, albeit a fictional patient. What else did we say?
Pretty much demands unquestioned loyalty.
Yeah, and what happens when you, so the idea was that she actually demands unquestioned loyalty. And what happens when there, meaning any individual interacting with her, loyalty is questioned?
She eliminates them.
Yeah, she definitely has that power to eliminate them from whatever it is we want to describe as those meetings. All right. Anything else of interest here?
One thing that I kind of thought was interesting, around that time with being birthed 2 years ago, she noticed that all of her limbs felt like strangers to her. So I thought that was kind of interesting, her rebirth story.
All of her limbs felt like strangers to her. Now, that's certainly something we want to keep in the back of our mind. Now I will ask for clinical terminology that might be used to describe that subjective experience.
Depersonalization.
Right, that could be depersonalization. All right, that definitely could be depersonalization. And perhaps that allows us to focus on different chapters in the DSM if and when we begin to formulate what may be going on from a psychiatric perspective through a psychiatrist's lens. All right, so anything else?
She's really good at manipulating. She is able to see insecurities in people. And again, my comment from today, she gets a really strong reaction, not at first, but then as soon as she started speaking, I had this very keen awareness of what she was doing to people. She just has a way of speaking that makes people either bring out what they're really feeling or fabricate what they're feeling to kind of match what she's asking for.
Yeah.
So she's very good at manipulating.
It does appear to be some level of manipulation, charisma, in terms of her interacting with people and perhaps extracting from them what she is looking for, whatever that might be. So there's definitely an element of that. All right, so from this perspective, in terms of a case formulation, would we think that Maggie is afflicted? Actually, let me kind of just take a step back. If we had 99 undergraduate Rutgers University students in this room today, safely distanced, of course, and we asked the question of whether or not we thought Maggie was afflicted with either A, a mood anxiety spectrum, versus B, a psychotic dissociative spectrum, what do you think the consensus would be out of those 99 responses? A or B? B?
I think so.
Okay. So if B, then we have to choose one illness that represents B from which to work. And the illness we're going to choose is the illness we will always choose, whether we apply it to a case analysis from a film, that is a film analysis, or a case formulation after a real patient interaction. So from the psychotic dissociative spectrum, arbitrarily, what one illness does this group choose as our starting point?
I guess going on what I said, like depersonalization, derealization syndrome.
So we're saying, let me again repeat the question. We're going to say arbitrarily this group, every time we think somebody is struggling with psychosis/dissociation, we're going to always start with depersonalization, derealization disorder in terms of our starting point.
More like schizotypal.
How about schizophrenia? I'll make the choice for us, only because I've been doing this for a couple of years now. Schizophrenia. Schizophrenia is, again, when we're going to apply this, every patient that we say is choice B. Purely arbitrary, this time it'll be my call. Schizophrenia has 5 inclusion criteria, of which the individual must demonstrate 2. What are the 5 inclusion criteria for schizophrenia per the DSM-5? Delusions. Hallucinations. Disorganized or catatonic behavior.
Disorganized speech.
Disorganized speech or thought process, which are, of course, are all examples of positive symptoms of schizophrenia.
And then negative symptoms.
And negative symptoms, okay? Those are the 5 inclusion criteria. The individual who presents with regard to what looks like it to be a psychotic process must have 2 of those 5. Does Maggie rule out? Yes or no? Does she have any?
And I feel like she's kind of like negative behavior. Like she's very like apathetic.
Does she believe it though?
Yeah.
But
I think that's the, is she manipulating people and saying these things, or does she actually believe them and is somehow also manipulating them? That was if you separate those two, then I don't know if they're true conclusions.
And when we don't know, at least for teaching purposes, I would suggest we say yes. So therefore, we will check that proverbial box for delusion. We'll include negative symptoms and say, she appears to have 2. Let's continue talking about this. And the next step is acknowledging, appreciating that this condition called schizophrenia is a diagnosis of exclusion. And the DSM, the American Psychiatric Association, requires that we now investigate 5 illnesses and definitively rule them out before we continue with this case formulation. What are the 5 exclusionary criteria for schizophrenia?
Mood disorder with psychotic features.
Primary mood disorder, number 1.
Substance-induced.
Substance-induced psychotic disorder, number 2.
Medical problem-induced.
A mood disorder due to another medical condition, number 3. Number 4 is a condition called schizoaffective disorder. It's a primary psychotic disorder defined through co-occurring mood symptoms during the entire episode, which is usually chronic, that is measured in decades. And the 5th and final exclusionary criteria or exclusion criteria of schizophrenia is an autism spectrum disorder. Okay. Now, in a larger or in a more in detail didactic, we will investigate each of these 5. I want to go a little bit for time constraint purposes in a little bit of a different direction and just simply approach this as an open-ended question. Do any of these 5 appear to be in play and perhaps higher in the differential for what ails Maggie than schizophrenia?
If we believe she has a true medical condition as portrayed by the way she's acting, then medically induced would be higher differential.
That's right. Right. We already mentioned it, so we're already kind of behind the 8 ball. If we don't really believe that, we have to somehow forget that we talked about this already. So I think that a psychotic/dissociative disorder due to another medical condition is going to have to remain in our differential, and it will be higher in our differential in as much as we know we have to now investigate that and definitively rule that A, she's healthy, and B, if she's not healthy, the underlying medical condition would not be expected to result in the behavior that we're identifying or observing in Maggie. Right? So that's certainly something, and the bottom line here is that Sound of My Voice may be a fictional case study of a psychotic/dissociative process, rule out schizophrenia versus psychosis due to an underlying medical condition. Right? And we would have to go through the same type of conversation, the same type of progression for those other 4 exclusionary criteria as well. But for time constraints, or due to time constraints, we'll leave it here. Because I want to get to the next step of the conversation. And that is, if we nerded out and took notes on this particular film, the way we would in front of a real-life patient, if we hypothetically took notes and began to cross off everything on that page that is explained away by what we just talked about, would there be anything left? Because if the answer is no, we're done. If the answer, of course, is yes, well, we better identify what's left on that notes page because we have more discussion that we have to engage in. So, another way of reframing this question is there anything bothering you that you've observed in watching Sound of My Voice that you don't feel comfortable attributing to our differential of schizophrenia, rule out psychosis due to another medical condition?
Well, I also thought it was interesting that there's this older man who seems to be like actually the head of everything. He was the one who found her. And I thought that was an interesting dynamic because even though she's like the figurehead for the cult, he seems to be like behind the scenes, like stirring the pot. And I think that you could consider like a mentality by proxy type situation, or even just like an abusive situation where he's holding her in the basement and forcing her to like legally do it.
So identifying that there's another character whose name I'm just blanking on right now in this movie, an older gentleman that is part of this cult, or this group at least, that may actually be even more manipulating than Maggie herself, as evidenced by his perhaps being the leader of the group, albeit behind that proverbial curtain, the wizard, if you will. If that's the case, does that remind you of anybody? True crime? Infamous?
So one thing that he kind of struck me as, so he has this scene where he is eating an apple and he's kind of like picking out the seeds. So that kind of brought me back to like Manson or one of those other, I forget the second one's name, Temple maybe, where they have like the cyanide that they extracted from the fruits. So that kind of made me think of paralleling him to one of them.
Exactly. All right. So this might actually be a movie about a cult, and the cult's leader may not be the person that we truly think it is. And it might actually be an alternative character who is picking out seeds to extract cyanide for something that's on the horizon that is maybe the sequel to this movie. We've seen this before. And we can merge your description with another individual, that is Charles Manson, who is very, very manipulative with regard to what we now know as helter-skelter, but himself never having laid a single hand on any of those victims. And inasmuch as we identify people like Squeaky Fromm as the family, and that was the name of his followers, his cult, so too now do we see maybe Maggie being just part of the family, and that the true individual behind the scenes, behind that curtain, happens to be this unnamed, or at least from my perspective, unnamed leader. So that could be going on here. She might be victimized. And to the extent, remember, Manson manipulated his family with significant doses of cannabis as well as LSD.
That's because you were saying rule out primary medical condition. I also would put substance, because if he's doing the treatments, we have no idea what he's putting in.
And we'll quickly elevate that to the level of medical condition with regard to arriving at the possible diagnosis now, what is now number 3 on our list of schizophrenia. Right? All of a sudden, we can see how the presentation of new information has to be integrated into our case formulation, dropping schizophrenia down to perhaps 3 in our differential, now behind both medical condition and the influence or the direct effects of a substance. Right? So, and that might be something that Maggie is using similar to Manson's family recreationally, or being dosed through some kind of a factitious by proxy mechanism and getting her in a frame of mind pretty much against her. Now, with this new information, looking at our notes pages, if we were to cross off everything on our list, would there still be anything left, or are we done with this conversation? And I heard manipulative before, so manipulation certainly is going to be part of what we just discussed, so I'm going to say that gets crossed off the list. But there was something else brought up that I'm not so sure has been explained by any of the differential that we've discussed.
The trauma that she said that she endured when she woke up upside down in a bathtub, and then she had like these odd symptoms afterwards.
Now there is evidence in the literature to suggest that individuals with schizophrenia have a significantly high incidence of dissociative symptoms. So this is not to say that what we have written in our notes doesn't explain this, but we should look into this a little bit more, because Maggie does talk about depersonalization. Certainly with regard to the agent's report, that is the collateral information we get from people close to Maggie, we understand there's an element of dissociative amnesia. And it looks like, given the flashbacks that we see, it might even be a fugue state. So it's dissociative amnesia with fugue. So I mean, these are freestanding illnesses outside of the psychotic disorders chapter, right? So the final step that we're in right now, again, reviewing our notes page, making sure we explain everything on it, is presenting, I think, additional illnesses in our differential, and it's put us in a different chapter that is itself titled the Dissociative Disorders chapter. What is considered to be the mildest form, and again, for dissociative disorders in general, we still have to rule out medical condition and substance, but fortunately we've already done that, because in getting here, we've already kind of went through the psychotic disorders chapter, and we knew we had to do that for the psychotic disorder, so the same thing holds true here, and we don't have to repeat the process. We've already done that. So now we're looking at the dissociative disorders, and certainly what is considered to be the mildest form is a condition called depersonalization, derealization disorder. It's exactly what it sounds like. Individuals with this condition have clinically significant depersonalization and or derealization. And her subjective sense that her arm was heavy or didn't feel like it was attached. What was the actual comment?
She said it seemed like it had been from like someone else or something else, because she had been like a new person from the deal. Like she didn't recognize her arm.
So often referred to in outside of the medical literature as the alien hand syndrome or alien arm syndrome. It's just but a specific example of depersonalization itself, part of depersonalization, derealization disorder. Okay. So question. We've now arrived at our final diagnosis of Maggie in Sound of My Voice as being a fictional case account of depersonalization, derealization disorder. True or false? Why not? Why is there still more in the differential?
At least for me, I still consider personality disorders as well.
So you're saying, to paraphrase, you're saying that there's still more stuff written on those notes pages that would not be explained by depersonalization, derealization disorder as well. And I think that's true. However, I think there's something else we should briefly talk about before we go there.
I guess if you're just mentioning along the spectrum of the dissociative syndromes, we haven't ruled out like dissociative identity disorder.
And dissociative amnesia. All right, so if we're going to continue in a graded response, Dissociative amnesia would be the next severe illness to consider, and she certainly rules in for that. There are two types of dissociative amnesia, if you will. That is, there's a qualifier, with fugue and without fugue. And it looks like this may be a case study of dissociative amnesia with fugue. In that definition of dissociative amnesia, individuals can report depersonalization and derealization. It does not come as a separate diagnosis. And the other way of just restating this is that when somebody rules in for clinically significant depersonalization and or derealization, we better double check that it's not part of a larger disorder. And in this case it is. And that disorder is called dissociative amnesia. Specifically, dissociative amnesia with fugue. So to kind of restate the most likely diagnosis, it appears that sound of my voice is a fictional case account of dissociative amnesia with fugue. Of course, we can't say that until we investigate the most severe form of this illness called dissociative identity disorder, or DID. Do we think that Maggie's character has a distinct personality state that takes over her conscious awareness? I do not think so. So it does look like this is a movie about dissociative amnesia, specifically with you. Always revisit that proverbial thought exercise of looking at our notes page. Is there anything left now? And while there may be elements of traits that are consistent with a personality disorder, I think the clinician has to take note of this. But it really wouldn't change where we are right now, because we have to appreciate that all of this has to be addressed, whether we call it schizophrenia, rule out dissociative amnesia with fugue, or whatever else we may call it. That is, the primary mental illness has to be addressed and treated. And then we look to see if those personality traits, irrespective of how maladaptive they are, resolve. Because if they do, it was caused by the underlying active illness. If they don't, we've got something co-occurring. And that is the time the clinician has to investigate what that additional diagnosis may be. And there we would look at the personality disorders. That's where I think that fits in. All right. So that's the case formulation of Maggie. And it introduces this group of disorders called the dissociative disorders. Anything additional, whether on your notes page, while it may not impact our differential per se, because let's say the thought exercise is complete and we're all comfortable with this particular case formulation that we arrived at. Anything else in this movie that you think should be considered worthy of discussion regarding the field of psychiatry?
There was one thing that kind of struck me as the main character who kind of becomes so obsessed with Maggie and the cult that he's even willing to abduct a child. Like that, to me, kind of, he was getting there and then he just passed a line. That was the thing I thought was interesting.
And remember, when we deal with behavior that we identify, in this case, as interesting, as a clinician, we have to ask ourselves, is it clinically significant? And abduction would be. I think that easily passes that threshold. And is it a change from previous functioning, right? Because if it is not, we may be dealing with a mental disorder, but certainly our differential will be streamlined versus those in a different column that are, in fact, a change in previous functioning. And in this movie, it is. I mean, because he's the one who starts out playing, if you will, like bad cop, right? Here we have a person that appears to kind of change with regard to his evolution, his character development, and now, having been manipulated perhaps, is resorting to abducting a child. And his partner actually calls him out. Remember, prior to him doing it, she is confrontative and tries to hold the mirror up to him. You've changed. Right? So I think it's a very interesting twist here. And it says a lot about this particular character. Some history of which we think has been disclosed in the Apple scene, although he then denies it, which again is very consistent sometimes with patient histories. That is how an initial eval might actually, information contained therein, changes with regard to follow-up information and reassessment. So that's something to consider here as well. What do you think's really going on here? Sometimes a psychiatrist gets involved to assess a mental disorder that's within the context of something that is much, much larger.
He evidently has some childhood trauma that he hasn't disclosed or really resolved.
Who's that?
The main character.
Main character. Yeah. And again, I think he did disclose it, although he kind of tries to retract it. So yeah, I think there's elements of trauma here, which is interesting because we would assume the same, or I think it's suggestive that Maggie has the same similar history. So there's a parallel with regard to a shared past psychiatric history or developmental history in those two characters, which is interesting.
It doesn't, it bothers me because we're talking about that he would endanger the life of another child. So I think that was a disconnect for me too, because if he had some sort of childhood trauma where he was put in an unsafe situation and taken advantage of, the jump to then bring a child, like kidnap a child, it doesn't make sense.
It doesn't make sense to the third person observer until you accept the idea that maybe this is a crude barometer of the severity of what he's struggling with, and that it's clouding his judgment. All right. So again, formal judgment is an assessment that is part of the routine psychiatric assessment, specifically the mental status exam. And at this point, you're right. I mean, if this person's history suggests that we would think they would be more empathetic, and he's not. Matter of fact, he's quite the opposite. Maybe that's a crude barometer in terms of how severe this really is. And here's someone who looks like he's had it under total control for most of this movie, but maybe we were off base in assuming that this is much more severe than at least initially met the eye. Yeah. Any other interesting aspects of this film? Come on, how in the world does she know that handshake? After we get our psychiatry hat on, after I manipulate your minds and watch this movie through a psychiatrist's lens, she knows the handshake. And Maggie actually asks her, where'd you learn that? What was the answer she got from Abigail?
You say like I watched her or something?
What was her, do you remember her actual comment?
She said you taught it to me.
You taught it to me. Come on. What's going on here? Is this about time travel after all? I mean, think about what you, at 2 o'clock in the morning at APS on call, when you used to take call at APS, having heard that, now what are you going to do? Because you're seconds away from calling your attending to discuss the case. Boy, man, waking your attending up to tell this part of the story, they're going to ask you, the teaching attending should ask you, what do you think is going on? In other words, time travel really going to be part of the conversation?
So I was thinking that she was like this woman who got into legal trouble, her daughter got taken away from her, and this is her like big grand scheme to see her daughter again. You get a cult following, you get one of them to basically kidnap her daughter and bring her back to her.
So you do think Maggie and Abigail have had a pre-existing relationship, i.e. the prequel. There's no real prequel to this movie. But the hypothetical prequel, that was only reestablished now. And that was the whole reason why she manipulated this group to find her and to abduct her. Right. Anybody agree, disagree, any other thoughts?
Because the father's drugging her.
Yeah, the father appears to be drugging her.
So it fits with, like, if she's having severe mental issues from the loss of her mother or some of that trauma, it stands to reason that maybe she is trying to steal her again.
Was there any allusion to that drug being insulin? For whatever reason, I remember it as such, but that may have been only in my own mind in terms of that being a medicine and not a drug.
I think it's because she sleeps at really random times, which is what led me to believe that it wasn't something that you would need normally administer.
I agree. So this young girl is getting drugged. She eventually gets near abducted by two different characters who actually may have had a past together. Again, AKA that prequel. Anything else?
One of the final lines that she tells Peter is something along the lines of, "It's your choice." And I wasn't really sure exactly what to make out of it. And I guess just because of the open-ended nature of the ending, she was offering him like a chance to either believe for her, that she's a time traveler, or that she has one of the underlying disorders that we talked about.
Okay. So she does have that comment to Peter at the end. So I mean, one other conspiracy theory that allows that to fit in is getting back to why collecting those apple seeds. It may have been that Maggie, very similar to some leaders who are part of a suicide cult, don't take part in the actual ritual themselves. In Jonestown, Reverend Jones did not drink that quote-unquote Kool-Aid. His followers did. But he somehow, all of a sudden, wasn't thirsty. And if that's the case, if Maggie's true goal was to abduct, we'll say, her daughter, it may be in her benefit to certainly get rid of the witnesses who may have some insight to where she's going next or what her plans are. So,
Or her daughter, her supposed daughter. She could kill her so that the husband can't have her. I can see that possibly as like a act for herself, that she would kill herself and her daughter. Not necessarily the other people, because who's going to believe the other people necessarily?
so that idea would come from the belief that maybe Maggie is separated, estranged from her partner, and not only is abducting her daughter, but then also perhaps has a plan to include Abigail in that suicide.
Which expands the conspiracy theory that the person manipulating her, who's the male character, is her father, possibly. And that way, when she gets dragged off, he says, I'll call the lawyer, which means that it happened at some other point. Because to very quickly say the lawyer instead of a lawyer. I went down a rabbit hole with this.
No, that's actually, the rabbit hole is where we got to go with this. That's the whole idea of CABnormal activity. Along those lines, it's very interesting that one word, a one-syllable word switch from a to the can absolutely, and again, who knows, maybe the writer-director just wrote the wrong word down on a script. We're talking the difference of two letters, but maybe not. So this has happened again. And there is an established lawyer. Right? Very interesting take. So we're going to actually leave it there. And again, the idea that we floated this conspiracy theory and the initial idea that we formulated this case as a fictional case of a mental disorder are not necessarily mutually exclusive. Right? So that is to say, if Maggie is apprehended by the agent, I'm sure, I would be very sure, that a psychiatrist would be part of the process. She would likely undergo psychiatric evaluation as she proceeded in court. Right? So we'll end it there, and we'll be back at 12:30 for our case discussion on Evil Dead 2, Dead Michael.